Welcome back to HC Daily as we continue in the podcast here in 1 Peter chapter 2. And this is going to be a challenging one for us, Wesley. He deals with several different issues. He deals with authority. He deals with maybe one of the most difficult topics, slavery here. And then ultimately, we look at Jesus and what Jesus went through. So that's what we're going to be talking about today on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forrester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
Okay, so Chris Zarbaugh is out of the studio. He wasn't able to be with us again today, so Wesley's finishing up the week with us, and so it's been great, Wesley, having you. So we've been learning a little bit about your life and about how your wife has been so blessed to be married to you, wonderful daughter that he's given you, Faith. But I mentioned a couple days ago in one of the podcasts that my family, we just got back from Traverse City. My favorite places are when we're out in the wilderness, in nature. I love Western Michigan, Northwest Michigan. I love anything that's hard and rugged and out in the bush kind of a thing anywhere in the world. And so I find myself often craving to go back to those kind of things.
Yeah.
And I don't feel, my normal everyday life feeds some of that. So when you are thinking about going away for vacation, when you're thinking about, that place I want to go back to, what's that place? What's that place that you long to go back to?
I would say it's probably not one place specific. I love the water.
Oh, water.
So whenever I can go anywhere near the water, whether it's a lake, an ocean, I absolutely love it. Sometimes my family and I, we will literally get into our car, drive down I-75, go like really far down, get off the freeway at about, I don't know if that's Brownstown, hop off the freeway. There's a huge automotive plant over there.
Yeah.
Take that all the way over to the river and just like ride the river literally all the way back up through Grosse Point all the way. So I absolutely love the water.
That's all the Detroit River there.
Yeah, the Detroit River there. It's just relaxing, peaceful. So anything water related, I love.
So what do you like to do? Where do you go for vacation? What's your favorite kind of vacation?
For vacation, we go to New York a lot. So we've done that a lot. I have a brother who lives there. I also love Atlanta.
Oh.
Love Atlanta a lot.
Hot Atlanta.
Yeah, mainly because of the food. So whenever I go to Atlanta, it's literally like a food trip, and I'm hitting a bunch of restaurants.
This is why I love you, Wesley. I love to travel by food as well.
Yeah, they have some great restaurants.
We came back from our vacation a few days ago, and people were asking us, so how was your trip? And I was talking about restaurants.
Yeah, that's how it is when I go to Atlanta. That's
great.
where I discovered this thing, Jeff. If you've never had this, you haven't lived. Sweet potato cheesecake.
Sweet potato cheesecake.
It is amazing.
Okay.
But here's the thing. You got to love both. If you don't like sweet potatoes or you don't like cheesecake, you're not going to like this.
Right,
you got to like both items. And it's
good, huh?
It's amazing.
All right. I might have to try some. Bring some back next time you're down there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are in 1 Peter chapter 2. There's some controversial stuff in here.
Yeah.
We'll unpack it as best we can. We don't pretend to be experts on these things, but we'll give some perspective, and hopefully we can help some people. So we're going to read verse 11 through the end of the chapter of 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Here's what it says. Dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they'll see your honorable behavior, and they'll give honor to God when he judges the world. For the Lord's sake, submit to all human authority, whether the king is head of state or the officials he's appointed, for the king has sent them to punish those who do wrong and to honor those who do right. It is God's will that your honorable lives should silence those ignorant people who make foolish accusations against you. For you're free, yet you are God's slaves. So you don't use your freedom as an excuse to do evil. Respect everyone and love the family of believers. Fear God, respect the king. You who are slaves must submit to your masters with all respect. Do what they tell you, not only if you're kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. For God is pleased when, conscious of his will, you patiently endure unjust treatment. Of course, you get no credit for being patient if you're beaten for doing wrong, but if you suffer for doing good and endure it patiently, God is pleased with you. For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you. He is your example, and you must follow in his steps. He never sinned, nor ever deceived anyone. He did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threatened revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. By his wounds you are healed. Once you were like sheep who wandered away, but now you've turned to your good shepherd, the guardian of your souls.
Yeah, no, this is great.
Well,
Jeff, I think it may be good if we just right off the bat explain when it talks about being slaves to God.
Okay.
In that particular context, it's not talking about slavery how we may be used to it here in Western civilization in terms of African slavery, slaves coming over, working plantations in America. It's not talking about slavery in that context. The Bible was written a couple of thousand years before that took place. It's mainly, and I'm painting with a broad brush here, it's mainly looking at it from the perspective of like an indentured servant.
Yeah.
So just wanted to add a little clarity. It's not talking about slavery as in what we would have experienced and understood in American history.
What would be called in American history, the kind of slavery we had was Chantal slavery.
Yeah.
The ownership of humans would be different than
what's being
indentured
referenced here.
servitude
Yes.
that's being mentioned here.
Yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Indentured
really quick.
servitude wasn't the only kind of slavery in the Roman Empire.
Mhm.
There was some ownership, but the huge majority of slaves either there was no social security, there was no social net.
Mhm.
So if you found yourself unable to pay your bills or to take care of yourself, maybe you'd go to a powerful person or a rich person and you'd become an indentured servant for a period of time. Maybe, okay, I'll sign a contract 10 years or whatever, and 7 years. And then in exchange for shelter and food and clothing, you wind up working at their will, right? Also, there was slavery based on crimes. So if you committed certain crimes, instead of putting you in prison, instead they would have you work off your thing. And so it'd be attached to a sentence, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, something like that. And then there was also debtors' slavery, where you'd become an indentured servitude because you owed money you couldn't pay. If they put you in prison, you don't have the ability to pay it. So instead, they'd make you work it off.
Yeah.
And so there were multiple kinds, and all of those were called slaves. Then there were also the slaves that were conquered from outside the Roman Empire, and they would be brought back. And even those usually had an end to the slavery time. They would come to a point where they would earn their slavery, or in their slavery, most of the time they were paid. They were compensated as slaves. Not much, but they would be compensated, and then they could save their savings and then purchase their freedom that way. That's very different than the Chantal slavery, where there was no compensation. It was just ownership of humans. It was a human trade, and that human trafficking, and that was a very different thing, very different stain on American history from what Paul is talking about here. So he's not endorsing the kind of slavery we had.
Yeah, and
he's not even endorsing Roman slavery here. He's just saying the circumstance you find yourself in, succeed at it.
Yeah, and I will toss this in. I'm very aware, not being naive in this point, that with some slave owners here in the United States, they would use that passage.
Oh, sure.
In terms of you who are slaves must submit to your masters with all respect.
Right.
I'm very cognizant of that fact, but we're just pointing out from a biblical perspective, that's not the type of slavery that the writer was talking about here in 1 Peter.
Right. That's why it's important to become not only a student of the words on the page, but also a student of the context it was written in.
Yeah.
Right? So a student of history. Yeah. And otherwise, we can take the plain words on the Bible. That's like the guy who he just opened up his Bible. He was trying to figure out what God wanted him to do. He just opened up his Bible, and it said, and Judas went out and hung himself. And he's like, oh, I don't want that. He closed the Bible, opened it back up, and said, go and do thou likewise. Right?
Yeah.
Well, if you just grab a couple of sentences, you can make the Bible say whatever you want it to say.
You can justify anything that you want to justify.
Yes.
You can find some vague reference to a verse to support your position.
And so that's what American slave owners that were using Bible verses to justify. That's what they were doing, is they were taking it out of context.
Yeah.
But in these circumstances, the only way you can have any kind of context would be understanding the historical circumstances.
Yeah.
within the Roman laws. And, those things are written down. We can learn those. Josephus wrote about them. Herodotus wrote about them. Tacitus wrote about them. Lots of different historians from the Roman Empire wrote about these things. So we know a lot about it. We can study it. We can learn it. What Paul is saying, or Peter is saying here, is very different from what was happening in America at the time. Although he's not giving an endorsement either.
Yeah.
Right? And he's recognizing there were good masters and bad masters in this circumstance. But let's go back a little earlier before we go into more on that. Again, he says, "I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners."
Yeah.
This is a theme.
Yeah, he's like
in
hammering
Peter's
that
writing.
in.
This isn't home.
Yeah.
As great as it is, you have the best family and the best circumstances, and you love the sunsets, and you've been on amazing vacations. Don't forget that this isn't home.
Yeah, this isn't it.
A lot of activists are fighting, trying to create utopia. This isn't home, right? So should we work to make life better? Yes. Should we work to make other people's lives better? Yes. Are you ever going to make it perfect? No. This isn't heaven, right? And so as good as we have it on earth, just understand, heaven is so much better. Maybe you have it bad here on earth. Trust me, heaven is going to be a great reward. And this short period of time, you're just a traveler passing through. You're a temporary resident. And eternity, if you lay up your treasure and put your focus on eternity, is going to be so much better. It's going to be the great reward. And so this is what he keeps trying to remind them. He said, so then keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls.
It's kind of like that tug of war we've been talking about between the carnal side of you, spirit side of you.
Yeah. But now he puts a twist on it, and he's saying the reason is you want to be careful to live properly among unbelieving neighbors.
Yeah.
So now he's talking about testimony. So on one side, we do the right thing because we're supposed to be holy like God's holy.
Yeah.
We're thankful for the fact that Jesus saved us. We've been bought with a ransom, he says. And now we do good and we live holy lives to honor God. That's one.
Yeah.
The other reason we live holy lives is because people are watching.
Yeah.
Which is consistent with what Jesus said. Jesus said, love God and love people. There's the horizontal and the vertical. And this is precisely, Peter has just spent 2 chapters unpacking what Jesus said in one verse.
Yeah.
Jesus said, love God and love people. Those are the greatest commandments. And Peter goes, okay, let me give you several chapters. Honor God, be holy, walk away from all this worldly living and worldly philosophies and wicked lifestyles. Be holy because God chose you. He paid for you. He ransomed you. And now he's saying, he pivots right here. And from this point on, everything else he says is in this context. The world is watching.
Yeah.
Lost people who are far from God, you might be the only Jesus anybody ever sees.
Yeah.
They may never read the Bible. They may never have any encounter with Christ other than Christians. And there's so many people. I think it's quoted that Gandhi said, "I like your Jesus, I just don't like your Christians."
Yeah.
Right. And so we should be the kind of people who represent Jesus. And instead, a lot of times we're not. And so this is why he tells us now that all these other things we're going to talk about, respecting authority, following our bosses, all those things. The reason we do those things is because of this verse right here.
Yeah.
This verse that the world is watching. Lost people are watching.
And I think it's worth asking, and it's talking about neighbors in a broader context, but I want to just make a more narrow discussion about that. For our listeners who are watching, what do your neighbors think about you?
Yeah.
Do your neighbors on your block that you live on right now look at you as a blessing in the neighborhood, or do they view you as a jerk?
Yeah.
And why?
Right.
So that would be the question. So how do those people around you view, when they have an issue in their life, do they feel like you're a person that they can run to for assistance, for help, for prayer? You know, how do they view you? So I think that's a great that's in verse 12.
That's a great way to view that. And then he's talking in 2 contexts that would be the most shocking to see a Christian act with kindness and humility in the middle of it.
Yeah.
The one being submit to government, especially this government, which we'll talk about in a second. The other would be slaves submitting to masters. Those would be 2 of the most shocking circumstances where people would expect you to be a jerk to the jerks.
Yeah.
That's what they'd expect.
Yeah.
Instead, when Christians go, I'm going to act like Jesus even when you're being a jerk in these circumstances as a slave or as towards a persecuting government, people go, wow, you're different.
Yeah.
Because that's not how I would act.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the purpose behind the rest of these chapters.
And that's what will draw them to Christ.
That's right.
Yeah.
Is the catching attention. So in between verse 13 and verse 17, he's talking about government here, right? He says, For the Lord's sake, submit to all human authority. The king, officials, right? For the king is sent by God to punish those who do evil. That's the primary job of government in God's eyes, is to bring God's judgment on evil behavior. So when we look at how to deal with criminals, it's you represent God here, bringing down God's judgment. That's what the government's supposed to do. So that's one. And then he says it's God's will that your honorable lives should silence those ignorant people who make foolish accusations against you. The government says these things. You submit to the government within reason, and then the world goes, "Oh wow, right? You're different."
Yeah.
The note, it's no secret. I mention all the time. I love the Life Application Study Bible.
Yeah.
And the notes for verses 13 through 17, it says, when Peter told his readers to submit to all human authority, he was speaking of the Roman Empire under Nero, a notoriously cruel tyrant. Obviously, he was not telling believers to compromise their consciences. In fact, Peter had told the high priests years earlier, we must obey God rather than any human authority. That was in Acts chapter 5, right? And then he says, but in most aspects of daily life, Christians can and should live according to the law of their land. Today, some Christians live in freedom while others live under repressive governments. All are commanded to cooperate with those in authority as far as conscience will allow. We're to do this, quote, for the Lord's sake, so that it is his good news and his people will be respected. If we face persecution, it should be for obeying God, not for breaking moral or civil laws.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's really the differentiation. He's not saying persecution should come because you're choosing to break the law. Persecution come because we're choosing to serve God rather than man, because man's laws have gone against God's laws at that point, right? So it's a surprising thing because Nero is the one that eventually killed him. Nero took Paul's head. Nero crucified Peter upside down. This is a pretty horrible tyrant at this point, and the people are under this kind of oppression. And so that's why he highlights these two in the context of the world is watching. You can capture people's attention when in the worst possible moments of your life, you choose to honor God, it'll capture the attention of people who are far from God.
Yeah, and I could see how someone in that respect, in those worst moments, like you said, they're expecting a certain behavior from you. And when you do the exact opposite, you're showing love, you're showing grace. They're like, wait a minute, tell me a little bit more about your God that you serve. Tell me more about this Jesus that you keep talking about.
Yes. So he's talking about governments there. He talks about slaves in just a second. But this could be applied in other things. At Freedom Hill, at the big baptism event, we told the story of a young man who said his aunt was dying of cancer. And he saw the difference in her life and her faith. And that's what got his attention. So the worst moment of her life wasn't government oppression. It wasn't slavery. The worst moment of her life was she was dying of terminal cancer, and yet the confidence and the faith she had in Christ got his attention. So that was a circumstance. Paul could have written about cancer here, not just slaves or about government issues. When you get robbed, or when you lose your job, or when somebody destroys your reputation online, or when your marriage ends in a horrible divorce or whatever, the world is watching. And so in those worst moments, that's what he's trying to challenge us to. In those worst moments, be like Jesus. And if you are like Jesus, because that's why he ends the chapter with Jesus. He doesn't end it with more slavery and government issues. He ends it with, because Jesus acted this way. In his worst moments, Jesus was at his best. And if we choose to act like Jesus in our worst moments, we can change the opinions and the hearts of people who otherwise would never hear the words we say. But they see the lifestyle that we're living, and they see the attitude that we have, and that captures attention and said, they're different. And that reflects a lot of what James was telling us before, too.
A way that I like to look at it is, who are you when the lights are out? When the lights are out, who are you? When the lights are on, we're all holy in the light. We're all holy on Sunday. Everyone's, God bless you. That's great on Sunday. But at your worst moment, if someone were to look at your life then, who are you? Do you reflect Christ then? Do you reflect Christ when that guy with the big truck with the big wheels cuts you off in traffic on your way to work?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one.
Do you reflect
Hey,
Christ
you
then?
just went from preaching to meddling. I saw you looking at me.
But that's the key. Again, who are you on Monday morning? Sunday, yes, you're holy. Everybody's holy on Sunday.
Right.
But who are you Monday?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he talks about suffering here. And I love the notes for verse 21. It says, we may suffer for many reasons. Some suffering comes as a direct result of our own sin. Some happens because of our or someone else's foolishness. Some comes from living in a fallen world. And Peter is writing about suffering that comes as a result of doing good, right? And this is what Jesus suffered, not because of the evil that he done, but because of the good that he was doing.
Yeah.
And so when you read about Peter's not talking about those other kinds of sufferings.
Yeah.
Here. He really is talking about when you're choosing to do good and your boss lets you go because you did the right thing instead of faking the numbers at work. Okay, you're suffering, but God's going to bless you. And by the way, Jesus suffered or whatever. When you're suffering because you're choosing to continue to stand for right in a world that is, the Bible says that in the last days, the world is going to say evil is good and good is evil.
Yeah.
Right? And man, we're seeing that all the time. They're redefining all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Saying it's good instead of evil. And so he said, if you wind up suffering for standing for what is right, for being light in the darkness, okay, that's what Jesus did. And you can withstand it in the same way in the power of Christ and his Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and I think people need to understand also, Jeff, that when they do that, like you're talking about being let go on that job, whenever you are obedient to God, you can never truly experience loss.
Right.
So yes, you may have lost that job, but God has many more blessings on the horizon for you from being obedient to him. So you're really never losing anything from being obedient to the Father.
Man, Wesley, I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us today on HC Daily. We hope to see you again next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.